Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on a Friday evening. Honestly, I was kind of second guessing whether or not I should do this one on a Friday, but it was the best day for me. So I hope you guys, oh my goodness, my voice. I hope you guys are having a great Friday. If you are just joining in, let me know in the chat where you're watching from. Feel free to say hi. It's always good to know who is watching. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about line of reasoning activities. Hi, Melinda. How are you? So these line of reasoning activities are going to be some things that you could do to introduce the concept of line of reasoning as you teach rhetorical analysis. These are some activities that I might do like once throughout the year or the semester, however you want to look at it. But they're kind of fun and they're a way to introduce that concept because line of reasoning, I feel, is a little bit, I don't know, it's a little bit of a tricky concept for students to understand. Excellent. Kate is here as well. Hi, Kate. How are you? So we have been talking for the past couple nights about different introductory activities. Day 1 was annotations. Day 2 was thesis statements. If you're just tuning into this day and you haven't seen the previous days, they are on my channel. Because of some tech problems, I am not able to screen share, but I have both lives set up on my YouTube channel. And after the live is over, I record it without all the extra chat. So that way it's a shorter, more condensed video in case you prefer that, because I understand your time is valuable. Awesome. We have Audra here from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. That's exciting. Hi, Kathleen. How are you? All right. Well, I don't want to take up too much of everyone's time, so let's go ahead and get started. But thank you again for joining me. Let me put a link in the chat for you in case you need access to tonight's handouts since I can't screen share. I have some pictures in the notes tonight so that you can kind of see what these activities look like. And I do have a few props to show you, but they're from the pictures. You'll see what I mean in a second. Hi, Tara. Okay, so I will post the link in the chat. It's just a bit.ly link and it should have you make a copy, and that way you have access to the notes. And also, before I forget, let me tell you so that you can remind me. Because you guys are tuning in live, I have an extra special bonus for you at the end of this session, just another little activity that you can do. So I won't put that in the chat just yet, but I'll include it at the end of this session because I have a bit of an announcement at the end of the session as well. So let's dive into talking about line of reasoning. Honestly, one of the things that I think is kind of funny about the revamp of the course exam description is that there are some terms that we now say pretty regularly that I honestly don't remember using before they redid the course exam description. Like line of reasoning was something that I don't remember talking about when I first started teaching AP Lang. I think I knew what it was. We sort of had an idea of it, but I don't remember actually using that phrase. Now I use the phrase somewhat regularly in my classroom. So line of reasoning, in case you're brand new to AP Lang and you're like, what is that concept? How do I teach it? I just tell kids it means a logical order. So it has to do with structure. And there are two basic premises that we need our students to understand. The first is that they need to identify the speaker or writer's line of reasoning. And part of the reason why they need to do this is because it leads to a better rhetorical analysis. They need to understand that writers and speakers make choices in a particular order because they're tailoring their message or their argument to their audience. And so because of that, they're going to put those choices in a certain order. For instance, typically speaking, a call to action comes at the end. And oftentimes I'll ask my students, why did they wait for that? Like, why not just start with it? And my students will kind of look at me and be like, well, because then people might not really be receptive to it. You have to convince them. Even if the audience fully believes in what you're saying, you still have to kind of build up to it. So students do understand a little bit about structure and line of reasoning anyway, but it's important that they figure out the structure of the passage. So to do this, I have my students divide the passage up into sections. And honestly, I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong way to do this, in the sense that I will oftentimes ask my students to either do it themselves or do it with a partner, and then they'll share out to the class and tell us how they divided it up. And usually there might be a couple differences. Like someone might say, oh, the beginning is paragraphs 1 to 4, and another group might say it's 1 to 3. So I just ask them to justify why they did that. But the key is that I want them to find the beginning, middle, and end. For a couple passages that I do that are on the shorter side, sometimes it's not 3 distinct parts, it might be 2. Like it might be first half, second half. The sections that students divide the passage into do not have to be equal either, and there doesn't have to be 2 or 3. It's possible that there could be 4. It just kind of depends. The most I've really seen for an exam length passage, in my opinion, is just 4. And, the idea is to look for shifts in topic, choice, or tone. That's what I tell my students to look for. Another term that we sometimes use as teachers is movements, which I like that term, but sometimes my students find it confusing. But they understand shifts in topic, choice, and tone. So we want them to follow the author's line of reasoning because that leads to a stronger essay. So instead of just looking for, let's say, repetition wherever they happen to find it in the passage, we want them to be thinking, okay, what's happening at the beginning, the middle, and the end? So in order to help students identify the author's line of reasoning, or at least to reinforce that concept, one activity that I have done with my students in the past, and some of you might have heard me talk about this previously, is something called Unscramble the passage. Now, I only do this with them once because once they've done it one time, it kind of loses its charm. And there is, excuse me, I'm losing my voice tonight. There is a little bit of prep work involved in this one, but basically what you do is you allow students to work in groups. Last year when I did it, we had groups of 4, and that seemed to be a good number, but depending on your class size, you might want to alter that. So I printed enough copies for each group to have one, and what I did is I basically added extra spaces between all the paragraphs, and I used a paper cutter to cut the paragraphs up so they were on strips of paper. I used a paper cutter because the first time I did this activity, I had a couple of students who decided to try to match up the cut marks. Like they were holding up the paper, trying to make it match up like a puzzle because I had used scissors. So pro tip, if you have access to a paper cutter, you can use that. So what you do is basically you make strips of paper that have 1 paragraph on it. Sometimes you can put 2 paragraphs if they're like really short and related. And what I do, in case I need to use the strips of paper later on in the day and I don't want to waste paper, is I will give like each group a symbol. So they might have a heart or a diamond or a star. And so what I'll do is I'll put like a little heart on all of them, all the strips of paper that go with that particular printout. Each group gets the same speech. And I'll just kind of mix up the passage. So I paper clip it and I distribute it to the groups. And then when I say go, they take the paper clip off and they have to organize the strips of paper as a group. And last year when I did it, I was really impressed with the conversations that I heard. So I heard a lot of like, oh, this sounds like it would go at the end because it's a call to action, or this sounds like it belongs at the beginning because he's identifying this or he's introducing this. And sometimes they got really nuanced. Like there was one part where it said like something about this, and it was kind of an unclear antecedent in context. And so they had to put it together and think, okay, wait a minute, what is the this that he's referring to? So great conversations. And basically the first time I did this activity, all groups got it right. So it's kind of like a race to the finish. This past year that I did it, no group got it right on the first try. So what I did, they were really close, but they mixed up a couple paragraphs, which led to a really good conversation later. So what I did is I had my answer key, if you will. I had a printed copy of the passage, and I went through in the first group to finish. The other ones were still working. I told them, okay, this one are correct. And then they knew which ones are wrong and they got to reorganize it. And then if another group finished, I would check theirs. And so it was a little bit of a friendly competition to reinforce this concept of line of reasoning. And once all groups had gotten it right, then we talked as a class about, what did you notice? Like, what did you talk about in your group? How did you know where some of these paragraphs went? And so it was a pretty fun activity. They enjoyed it. And like I said, it's not something that I would do maybe more than once, but I do think it could be a good way to introduce the concept of line of reasoning. I didn't put this on the handout, but I probably need to go back and add it, because something else that I had students do afterward is once they were able to get all the paragraphs in order, I think there might have been like 10 paragraphs, I had them divided up. So they had their strips of paper and they were able to say, okay, like these 2 paragraphs are the beginning, these 5 are the middle, these whatever are the like 3 or whatever it was are the end. And then we had that conversation of, okay, how did you divide it up? And because they were able to physically separate the strips of paper, it was kind of cool, as opposed to just normally what they would do is like draw a line on their passage. So we were able to have an entire class period worth of discussion based on them unscrambling the passage, and then us kind of talking about it. I did give them a copy of the speech later on that wasn't cut up, and that's the one that they were able to like use for annotations and whatever we were talking about in class later on in the week. So anyway, that's the first activity that I wanted to share with you. And again, the purpose of that one is to help students recognize the fact that writers and speakers make choices in a particular order. So the goal is for them to unscramble the passage to identify the writer's line of reasoning. And even if they don't get it right on the first try, it's still pretty fun, and I let them reattempt it. All right, so I'm going to pause for a second and just take any questions that people might have before I move on to the next activity. In your handout for tonight that I put in the chat, I believe I linked some samples that I had done last year. So if you receive emails from me and you typically you've gotten them for a while, I should say, you might have already seen this activity because I did send out an email about this all the way back in January. But last year I used the passage, it was Obama's eulogy for Ted Kennedy. And that had previously been on like the 2020 exam. It's one of the release prompts. So I used that one. And then one of the other times that I did it, I used Abigail Adams' letter, not the one that was on the exam, not the John Quincy letter, though I think you could use it for that. I had found a letter that Abigail Adams wrote to her husband that I really liked. And so we used that one. And that was the group that everybody got it right. But I don't know if they were getting it right because of their understanding of line of reasoning or because they were matching the scissor marks on the paper. So in looking at it for my class for last year, I felt like that letter was too hard for them. But I think most like contemporary exam passages could work for an activity like this. So you don't have to do the one that I provided. If you have an idea of one, I would love to hear it, because I think, this is kind of like a little think tank. So if you're like, oh, this would be perfect for that activity, let me know. You could also adapt this to a paragraph. I've seen a couple people do that, where instead of unscrambling a passage with paragraphs, they have students reorganize the sentences within a paragraph. I haven't found a paragraph that I love for that, but I do think the concept is very valid. So that could be another option as well. Would you possibly use the same passage for the scramble activity and the annotation practice? Yeah, you absolutely could if you wanted to. So that could be a way to introduce it. You could have them. So the thing about the unscramble the passage is that you don't want it to be a passage they've seen before. So before you have them annotate it, you could, on one day, you could do the unscramble the passage, and then the next day you could have them annotate, and that would actually be kind of fun for the annotations, because as they were unscrambling it, presumably they would have been talking about the passage anyway. So they might have already started to observe different choices. Especially if there's a call to action. Usually they can find that and realize it goes at the end in most cases. I'm struggling to come up with a passage where it was at the beginning. So usually I say it's at the end. So yeah, I think that could be good. So if you wanted to, instead of using these activities for different passages over the course of multiple weeks, I think those two activities could work really well together if you wanted them to. It's just a matter of the amount of prep work that you want to do. I try to spread these things out, but if you like the flow of that, I think that could be really fun. So yeah, that was an excellent question. Thank you, Melinda. Hey, Holly, how are you? All right. When do you teach types of reasoning, like inductive and deductive versus a line of reasoning? That's a great question. So with inductive and deductive, I might go over that if I see it in a passage. Like, we might talk about the difference, but to be honest with you, it's not something that I emphasize very much, mostly because I feel like my students specifically were really focusing on the rhetorical situation and rhetorical choices. And sometimes I worry if I throw one more thing at them, it'll just be too much. But I do think that once they have a good understanding of the rhetorical situation and rhetorical choices, we can then build to a conversation of line of reasoning. And I think depending on the passage you're doing, inductive and deductive reasoning could be a great thing to bring up. In the sense that I think those two things in particular would also work well if you're going from rhetorical analysis to later on to do synthesis or argument. Because one thing that sort of surprised my students a couple years ago is I had made a comment just offhand one day, and I said, as a writer, you get to make rhetorical choices too. And they were like, what, really? And I'm like, yeah, like they thought that only famous published writers made rhetorical choices. They thought you had to be a president or a published author to make a rhetorical choice. And I kind of understand why, because we had been reading all these like famous things, but no, they can make their own choices too. And so when we construct an argument, we make choices in that way. So I think there definitely is a place for that. If I remember, you stated that you spent about a week on one passage. One of my struggles is moving too quickly and assuming the students get it when they probably are not. Yes, so here's the thing that I sometimes worry about when I'm like making like lesson plans and resources to share with people is my pace is a little bit quick, but the skills sort of cycle back, if you will. And whenever I make lesson plans, I always put in the caveat that I teach on a 45-minute like class period. And so I might pace things in a different way than others would. So yes, I tend to go through like one passage per week, maybe week and a half, depending on what it is. But each passage that I have a specific goal for that passage. So just based on my teaching style, I don't try to cover every single thing for every passage, if that makes sense. I have found that if we do approximately one every week or week and a half, if there's like interruptions and stuff, I can introduce a concept and maybe revisit it with the next week's passage and kind of build that way, if that makes sense. But I know that pace might seem fast for other people. So if that's not how you do it, that's totally okay. I don't think it works for everybody, but that's my objective when I try to figure out what we're going to do. Is I have like a specific goal for each passage that I choose. And then I try to think about, okay, based on the goals of these passages, what's the best order to teach them in so that the skills are building and we cycle back to things. Just because I feel like sometimes I don't have the attention span to do more than a week or week and a half on a passage. And if I'm not into it, they're not going to be into it. But yeah. My textbook introduces it very early, which I think is confusing. Perfect idea to save it for synthesis and for your response. Yeah, I don't know. I just feel like there's so many new terms at the beginning of the year that for me, it's just like, it's not absolutely crucial. In the same way that I personally don't teach logical fallacies. It's not that I don't think they're important. It's just that it's one more thing that would stress my students out. And so I try to, especially at the beginning of the year, only teach what is essential, if that makes sense. And we revisit those concepts. I don't know if that made me sound like a really strategic teacher or like a bare bones teacher. I don't know which, but like I have found that a lot of my students, especially those that are in a lot of AP classes, like they have their points of stress. And so like my goal is to make the class manageable. And so if there's a lot of new terminology, I try to make sure that we understand those concepts before throwing in stuff that might not be needed for the exam. And I know there's more to the class than the exam, but I teach in a district where at almost 50% of the students are on free and reduced lunch. And for them, credit on the AP exam, the college credit is a game changer for them. And I know that's the same case for a lot of students, but my administration has said to me, we don't mind if you teach the test. We know they're learning what they need to learn. So yeah, anyway, but I keep it kind of basic in the beginning, but we cover a lot of ground, even though it's basic. All right. So I hope you guys like that activity. And you're welcome to use the passage that I included. But if you're like, I don't know if I'm ready for that, or I don't really like that one, you can definitely swap it out for a different passage. The instructions are still the same. And there are more detailed instructions in that link that's on the handout. So if you ever have any questions about any of this stuff, feel free to reach out and email me. Or you can contact me on Instagram or anything like that. I'd be happy to help. Facebook message. Anything. Anything I can do to help, I'm happy to. And if you do this activity and you find a passage and you're like, this worked really, really well, let me know so I can share that information with others as well. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is another really simple one. And it's just unscrambling the thesis and topic sentences. I created this lesson on a whim a few years ago, and for whatever reason, it worked well for that group. So I've done it like once a year since then. I don't think it's anything particularly groundbreaking, but it does kind of bridge the two different skills that I wanted to talk about tonight. So one is identifying the writer's line of reasoning, and the other is having students create their own line of reasoning. Because in order to score a 130 based on the rubric, that the difference between a 2 and a 3 is usually in some sense, the line of reasoning. I think that might be oversimplifying it a little bit, but the stronger essays have a better line of reasoning. So students need to not only understand the writer's line of reasoning for a rhetorical analysis essay, and also in some sense for the multiple choice, but they need to create a line of reasoning in their own. And so this one kind of bridges those two skills. So for this one, I use index cards, but you could have them use strips of paper if you wanted to. Either is fine. So basically what students do is, this is after they've read and discussed a passage. So they already have background knowledge about the passage. The students will divide the passage into sections. This is another group activity like pairs or small groups. So they'll divide it into sections, and then on the index cards, so I usually hand out like 4 or 5 index cards per group. On one index card, they'll write a thesis statement. And then on the other index cards, they will write topic sentences for body paragraphs. So it's 1 sentence per card. And usually I do this after we've gone over how to create movements in your own essay. So sometimes I'll give them sentence frames for this, which sometimes helps them start to realize that they want to link the different elements of their essay. So the part of the reason why I wanted to do this activity with my students is because some of them were struggling with not knowing how to navigate between paragraphs. So I'd see a lot of like, one choice the writer makes is this, and then the next body paragraph would be another choice the writer makes is this. And so they were letting the devices or choices drive the conversation as opposed to following that line of reasoning. So they write a thesis together, and then they write topic sentences, each on its own index card. And I try to have them use linking language. That's a term that somebody mentioned to me recently, and I had heard it before, but I was reminded of it. And I was like, I love that, linking language, to reinforce the line of reasoning. So one concept that I go over with my students is verbs like begins, continues, and concludes. So that way they can think about the movements in the passage. So those might be verbs that they include in their topic sentences. I also have a couple sentence frames that I give students once we really start thinking about moving from one body paragraph to the next. One is having already, and then it's like you refer back to what you said in the previous paragraph. So like, let's see, if we're doing Florence Kelly, having already established that child labor is a widespread problem, Florence Kelly then outlines labor laws in the different states. So something like that. So that tells us, hey, in my previous paragraph, I told you about how she's introducing the problem. Now I'm going to tell you about how she is analyzing these state laws. So that's a sentence frame that my students have really liked in the past. Another thing that they could do is they could say, Florence Kelly shifts from providing statistics about child labor to examining child labor laws, or whatever it is that they want to focus on. So that's another way to say, hey, in my previous paragraph, I talked about this, and now I'm going to talk about this. It's not a magic cure for essays, but it does help reinforce that line of reasoning, and it does help things flow a little bit better. So basically, really simple. What they did with this was they wrote out their 4 or 5 index cards. Each group had their own color pen, and they scrambled them up, and then they had to exchange with a different group, and they had to try to unscramble the group's index cards. So basically, the idea was, if your sentences were strong enough, the other group should be able to put it in order. The objective was not to try to trick the other team. The objective was, like, you want somebody to be able to unscramble your index cards and figure out which one's your thesis. So this would be another way to reinforce that defensible thesis if you've done that previously. And also, like, could they figure out which topic sentence would go to your first body paragraph, second, third, kind of thing. So they're identifying the writer's line of reasoning because they're looking for those movements, and then they're creating their own line of reasoning. Another way to do this activity that is kind of like the first activity is if you have like a student sample essay, like maybe one from the College Board, you could cut those paragraphs up and you could scramble them and then have students try to put it together, because that might also reinforce the concept. If they can't figure out which body paragraph should come before the other, then there's probably some linking language that's missing, or there might be some line of reasoning issues. So these are just some ideas to get kids a little bit more tactile. I know it's not like it's not as cool as like a science lab or something, but sometimes getting to manipulate things, even if it's just index cards, can be really helpful. And that one's pretty easy, low prep. You just need strips of paper or index cards. So yeah. If you have your own annotated copy of a passage, would you be willing to share it? Okay, so for Jennifer, yes, I would. For which, for any passage, or for a specific passage? I love the idea of choosing focus skills in a passage. So, okay, I think I understand your question, but maybe if you could just clarify, or if you want to just email me, if we want to kind of chat about it, that's absolutely fine too. For those who don't know my email address, well, technically I have 2, but the easier one to remember, I think, is just coachhallwrites@gmail.com. But yeah, I have a few passages that I've annotated for my own students. So if you're looking for just like a what do these annotations look like, I'd be happy to share that. But if that's not what you're asking, if you'll clarify, I can hopefully I can help too. All of the skills are important and transferable. I don't think of it as teaching to the test. I agree. Some people get a little picky about that. So I'm always nervous to say it, because like there's kind of like this negative connotation of teaching to the test, but I teach to the test. Maybe I need a t-shirt that says that. I don't know. I don't look at it as a bad thing, because I believe in the skills on the test. So therefore I teach to the test. And we also have life lessons with Coach Hall in my class quite frequently, because teenagers are teenagers. So yes, and Melinda agrees as well. Good. So I'm glad I'm not the only one that does that. I'd like to see your thinking. You mentioned choosing the skills for a passage and seeing. Yes. So I think I can perhaps elaborate on that briefly too. So some of the passages that I teach or at least this coming year, I'm going to teach early on. I decided to focus more on contemporary passages early on, because last year I did passages in both my 10th grade class and my AP class. And I wanted to kind of follow them in historical order, like chronological order. But my sophomores, especially, who are now going to be my AP Lang students, they said some of the older passages I gave them, they understood the choices, but it was all hard. But when we got to the contemporary stuff, it was easy. And I said, well, is that because you understood rhetorical analysis better? And they were like, maybe, but if you flipped it and we started with the easier, more approachable passages, it would have worked better. And so what I was thinking of this year, when I kind of took that unit and reorganized it, is, what are the major choices that I want students to focus on? So for instance, with Madeleine Albright's commencement speech, there are some examples in that. So I really want them to pick up on how she's using examples. And I might do that one and like Florence Kelly back to back. It doesn't really matter which order, but Florence Kelly also uses examples. And so I might introduce examples with, let's say, Florence Kelly. And then the next week I might follow up with Madeline Albright or something, just so that they can recognize how two different writers are using examples. And so we might focus on one skill with one speech, and then that same skill comes up in the second speech, and we might add on a new one or something like that. So I just try to think of, what are the more obvious choices that I want students to be picking up on? And I also try to think of the approachability of the passage too, because there are some really great ones that have been on the exam, but some of them, while I really like them, I feel like they're better if I save them for later on in the year. Usually by second semester, my students are like, okay, give us the hard stuff. This year before the exam, I asked them what they wanted me to cover, and they were like, give us the hardest exam prompts you can. Like, that's what they wanted. If I had given them those same prompts in like September, they would have freaked out. So that's part of what I mean, as far as like what I think of. Yeah. And yeah, you're welcome to email me too. But that's kind of what I try to think of as I'm putting stuff together, is like what choices are prominent, and then like how can I kind of connect these in any way. So that way there's kind of some consistency there. But again, I think it's really adaptable too. I don't think there's a right or wrong order to teach a particular set of speeches in. So there's that. Okay. So anyway, the index card activity is super quick, but it kind of has a couple different skills there. The final activity I want to tell you about is it has a little bit of prep work in it, but it is a paper chain activity. And if you have accessed the handout for tonight, you'll see that I included some pictures. I had put on my Instagram stories a picture of this because I was prepping for tonight. This was like a week ago, I think. And Megan sent me a picture of something that she had done that was really similar. And she was like, oh, I love your idea, great minds kind of thing. And I love her idea too. So basically, she was one of the ones that was talking about like linking language. And if you look at her picture, you'll see a paper chain and there's a blue link. And if I'm understanding what she was telling me correctly, that was the thesis. And then the other links in the chain, I think might be evidence and commentary. But the thing that she did that I thought was really interesting was that the thesis was in blue, there's blue highlighter, and she was having students highlight that linking language, because sometimes I think when we tell students, your paragraphs have to prove your thesis. Like, you have to make a claim in your body paragraph that proves your thesis. Your evidence has to prove your claim. Your commentary has to explain your evidence. While that is pretty straightforward in terms of understanding it, sometimes in executing it, it's not so. So I think the idea of highlighting that linking language could be really helpful. So I liked her way, and also her way involved a whole lot less colors than my way. My way, I had a bunch of different colored paper. But let me tell you about what I did. And in the picture, you only see part of it. It would be a much longer chain, but I was just kind of doing a mock-up. So what I did is I had different parts of it, this is kind of like outlining an essay, but in a paper chain form. And I think of course I think essays are totally valid. I think outlines are totally valid. And I do have my students make outlines, but every once in a while they want to do something fun, especially because the history teachers in our hallway are always doing crafts, and like that might make it sound like they don't do a whole lot. They are amazing, but like they have all these really creative ideas on how to make things fun. And I'm like, I don't know how to make English crafty, but this is one way. And this is also a way to get them to reinforce these concepts, but also have a little bit of fun. And you can put the paper chains up in your classroom if you want to. So for the most advanced way, it would require 8 colors, but you could definitely scale back and take some of these options out and have it be like 5 colors. So it's kind of what you think your students are ready for. But I actually have like what was in the picture. I have it here. So this is just part of it. But what you would do if you do all the colors is like you would have them write the rhetorical situation, kind of like those opening sentences of an essay on a strip like this. And then I did light green for their defensible thesis. And then these right here, I don't even know if y'all can see this well, but these would be their like topic sentence, evidence is the pink, commentary is the purple. So I require 2 like pieces of commentary or 2 commentary sentences per evidence. So that's why there's like extra links there, and then more evidence and commentary in a concluding sentence to get them. And I had it be the same color, I think. Actually, that one might be a darker orange, but I want them to realize that like the paragraph has to kind of wrap up. Because concluding sentences are something that I started noticing a couple years ago really made a difference to me when I'm reading essays. There were so many paragraphs that I read where students would just sort of end abruptly, and I would kind of forget what they were trying to prove, and then I have to go back and reread the paragraph and all that. Whereas when they would have a concluding sentence, as simplistic as it might sound, it was kind of like, oh, okay, yes, that's what they were trying to prove. And yeah, they did that. It kind of sealed everything together for me, kind of wrapped it all up. So anyway, this does require a little bit of prep and a couple of tips. Having made a mock-up, have them really pay attention to the direction their writing is going because that might make it look nicer if they're actually just, instead of just like arbitrarily putting the colors together, like have them think about how making a paper chain that could be easily read. I just used it wasn't Astro Bright's paper, but it's similar. It's like just thin colored paper and glue. And so, yeah, so I didn't actually write like examples on here. I just wrote the words, but this would be like the beginnings of it. And then if you were to do it for like the full essay, it would be longer. So this would probably take more than a class period. But it does reinforce that concept. And I like the idea of a paper chain because when I think of line of reasoning, I think of how things are all linked together and it builds off of each other. So it does sort of have like a fun visual to it, but it's also just something where like, if you want to have, I guess, like an academic outcome, but you also want to have them have a little bit of fun or like a little bit of a chill day, I guess this kind of blends both. Sometimes I notice my students need a break from the norm, but we still have to get work done. So this would be something that I think would achieve that. Which prompts do you see as the most difficult? For my students, I think Abigail Adams' letter to John Quincy is difficult. I like that one though. I like specifically like the metaphor. I like having students analyze that, but I think some of the language is a bit tricky. And that one is one of the lowest scoring in terms of like the average. It's one of the lowest scoring rhetorical analysis prompts from somewhat recent exams. The Chavez prompt, my students find a little bit difficult because they understand what he's saying, but they don't always know in terms of choices what to write about. I don't teach that one as much, but I do think it could be a really good prompt. And then the Gandhi prompt from a couple years ago. That one I found students were able to find choices, but they second guessed themselves as far as like what it meant, meaning like, they found, let's say, repetition or contrast or whatever it is. Like they knew what devices he was doing. They understood like what he was doing. But when it came time to actually write about it, I felt like students were a lot less confident in terms of responding to that prompt as, say, Florence Kelly, Madeleine Albright, the Margaret Thatcher one, Reagan's eulogy, that one's usually pretty approachable. I try to make sure that throughout the year, I do at least one commencement speech and one eulogy, just because those have a very particular rhetorical situation. And so it kind of helps because commencement speeches typically have a certain purpose and eulogies have a certain purpose. Like an inaugural address would be another one where, so I try to have a few where it's a certain occasion that they might see on the exam, just in case they're not familiar with those. These lessons are great differentiation. Yes. So you can adapt this one too. Like I said, like when I outlined it and it said 8 colors, like this rhetorical situation part right here, you don't have to have them do that. Like if your goal is just like thesis and like one paragraph, you can have them just do that. So if you're like, you know what, I don't have like a whole like 2-3 class periods, however long it would take to have them do the whole chain, you could just have them do like a thesis and a paragraph too, and condense the activity. So very adaptable as well. But you can kind of modify it to what your students need. And I think also depending on when you do this in the year might dictate what set of instructions you might give them. If you're doing it earlier on, and you're trying to introduce line of reasoning, then you might require less, like fewer links or fewer colors or something. Another way to adapt this that I'm sort of just thinking of is like, instead of it being the student's essay and their line of reasoning, in theory, you could do this with maybe like an article and they could follow the author's line of reasoning. You could kind of adapt it that way. I think that one might actually be a little bit trickier, but there are ways to adapt the concept. And paper chains are kind of something that are a little bit nostalgic for kids. So they might like that as well. I'm a new AP Lang teacher. What are your top 5 choices that you would suggest? Okay, good. So it's not necessarily, here's the thing. I see a lot of students writing about choices in an ineffective way. So for instance, students are great at picking up on repetition. They are not always great at writing about why the author is actually repeating a certain phrase. So I think repetition is important, but I also think students need to figure out the why behind it instead of just saying like to emphasize. Something that I see a lot when I read for our state mock exam is I see a lot of essays about logos, ethos, pathos. One of the biggest realizations I've had as an AP Lang teacher is that choices create appeals. So I try to teach my students that instead of looking for logos, ethos, pathos, we look for choices and then we think about, are they trying to be logical or appeal to an emotion or build credibility? So we don't necessarily go looking for appeals, but we might find choices and then it kind of lends themselves to an appeal, if that makes sense. So for instance, if you see examples, those come up sometimes. Sometimes examples are meant to be very logical. Other times they might be trying to strike an emotional chord with somebody. So I would say students should know repetition, but also how to write about it. I do think the appeals have a place, but I would focus more on things like examples, comparison and contrast. Students are probably already familiar with those terms, but those tend to come up. An anecdote is similar to an example in some sense. Like, so sometimes when I give students, if we've gone over anecdotes and then I give them a passage that has examples, sometimes they might use the word anecdote instead of example. So there is a difference, but those two kind of come up at times. Other people can feel free to chime in the chat. What are some of your top choices? I think word choice can be interesting, word choice and tone. I tell students, like, if you are ever stuck and you don't know what else to look for, look at the word choice and tone because it's always there. But again, those are some where students might not know how to write about it effectively. So yeah, those are some of the ones that I feel like maybe it's just the passages that I teach. But those are some of the ones that come up the most frequently. And I think those are also ones that students are ready for early on. And then sometimes there are passages where the choices might be more obscure and they really just have to ask themselves, like, what is the writer doing? I'm thinking of the Claire Booth Luce prompt from a few years ago, where she like flatters the audience. I like that one for a little bit later on in the year because they're able to tell me, oh, she's flattering the audience, but for whatever reason, sometimes they don't think they're supposed to write about that. So they try to find other things. And like, she has this illusion in there that the kids don't even really totally get. And so they're like, oh, I found an illusion. And I'm like, yeah, but you really don't have much to say about it. But you could talk about her flattering the audience because they're able to tell me why she's doing that. So sometimes it's about like getting them to realize that the word choice is actually super broad. And also getting them to realize that sometimes they might see something in the passage, but it might not need to make it into the essay. Yeah, illusions can serve many purposes. Yes. And I think with the passages that the College Board has chosen, usually if they're not sure if students are going to get the illusion, they'll at least put like a footnote or an endnote or whatever. So I think that helps. I don't have my students memorize like a ton of illusions or anything. I had a student transfer into our district and when she came in, she's like, yeah, I had to memorize all these illusions. And that's not how I would personally approach it. But I do think when they come up, it's helpful to point that out as well. Did you mean rhetorical choices or passages? Yeah. So those are the rhetorical choices that I would talk about. And some of the passages that I like, I've already said, but Florence Kelly, Madeleine Albright, those have both been on the exam. The Obama speech about Rosa Parks, this year's prompt about Sonia Sotomayor with identity. That one I feel like is a little bit harder maybe for like the beginning of the year, but I do think it's really valuable. It hasn't been on the exam, but Bush, his 9/11 speech, and also Reagan's Challenger explosion speech are both pretty accessible to students. And so those are good because they're sort of current too, and students are usually at least familiar with 9/11. Most of my students maybe have heard of the Challenger, but they don't really know anything about it. But those are good as well. Yeah, you have to teach what not to include. Yeah. Because it's understandable, but they're like, it's almost like with all the pressure they're under, they're like, oh, I found this choice. But then like, you don't really have a whole lot to say about it. And I've even said that to a class once, like, I don't even remember which passage we were doing, but I was like, yeah, so these are some choices that we found in the passage. And I could not, even as your English teacher, write about that one. I would not be able to develop anything insightful about that because it was one sentence. They were all kind of like, oh, okay. So sometimes admitting that like they don't have to focus on everything is helpful because it's not about throwing in as many rhetorical choices as you can. It's quality over quantity. And I think sometimes students need that reminder. Okay, so are there any other questions about line of reasoning or line of reasoning activities? If you have general AP Lang questions, feel free to let me know in the chat as well. I'd be happy to try to answer them. And I don't have to be the only one answering. I know we have some veteran teachers in here. So if you have suggestions or advice, feel free to include that in the chat as well. And so while I'm waiting for any like last minute questions, let me give you the link that I had told you about. And let me tell you what this little activity is. I hope it's helpful. I wanted to come up with something that people could use, and I was putting it together and I was like, oh, I hope they could use this, but even if they don't use my slides, they can at least take the idea behind it. And this is one that I know other teachers do, so I'm not trying to claim that I was like the very first to think of this idea or anything. But one of the things that I like to do at the beginning of the year to introduce rhetorical analysis is to have students analyze a commercial. And I know that some people teach on a block schedule. So if you happen to be one of those people who has like a semester long class, January can be a great time to do this too because of the Super Bowl. I haven't had students analyze Super Bowl commercials yet. I have some other commercials that I have them analyze, but the idea is still there. So let me tell you why I have students analyze a commercial. Usually we'll look at one together. I really like Nike commercials. I don't know if it's just because I was a former athlete and a coach, or but I do think like they're actually really good commercials in general. And if you happen to have a lot of athletes, it might resonate with them because it might make it more approachable. But I have students think about the rhetorical situation. So in that link, there is like a little grid that they can type on. So I ask them like, who's the speaker? For a commercial, sometimes there is like an actual famous person who's doing the voiceover. Other times it's more about the speaker as in the brand or the company. And I ask students, what does the speaker need, believe, or value? Because that influences their message usually. And that's kind of loosely tied to one of the AP Lang standards. We also think about the audience because I don't want students to say like, oh, the audience is everyone. There are a couple commercials where it has a very large audience. There were some good commercials that came out during the very beginning of COVID. I didn't include them in this, but they were kind of like rallying everyone together. So in those, I might concede that it's everyone. But usually we want to narrow it down. So like, is it sports fans? Is it young athletes? Is it female athletes? Is it, like who is it? And then what does that group need, believe, or value? Because that kind of ties into the message as well, because we need students to realize that the speaker, in the case of a commercial, the company is going to tailor it to the audience. So they're going to make choices based on who that is. And then context and exigence. Sometimes for commercials, this could be a little bit tricky depending on which one, but we want them to think of kind of like the big picture, any kind of related events. And then the exigence, like, is there something that the commercial is in response to? One of the ones that I really like to use for this, and it should be linked in one of the slides, is Nike came out with a commercial after Kobe Bryant passed away. And it was a tribute to him. And if you've never watched the commercial, I think it's a pretty good one for an activity like this. And because it was somewhat recent and students are familiar with who Kobe Bryant is, they're able to realize the exigence of that one, perhaps more so than some of these other commercials. And then purpose, and then message or argument. So anyway, I included some commercials that I have used with my students. Usually what I have them do is we analyze at least one as a class. So I'll show them the commercial and we'll kind of answer these questions that you see on that first slide. And then I will give them a list to choose from and they'll analyze one on their own. I like to give student choice. Also, I teach at a rural Southern district. So I tried to choose commercials that were non-controversial, I guess. But if you are interested in giving your students an assignment like this, please preview the commercials and make sure that they are school appropriate for your school. Because sometimes that, like, what's appropriate in one school is not appropriate for another. But I tried to choose ones that I thought students could relate to. So there's one about another Nike one, Dream Crazier. That one kind of focuses more on female athletes. The Always commercial, I was a little hesitant to put this one in there because Always is a feminine product brand, but my students haven't really gotten bothered by that. But the commercial itself is interesting because they kind of contrast, like they'll tell, it's like kids and they'll be like, run like a girl, and the kid like flails around. And like, so they're trying to emphasize the stereotype of like a girl, and they try to like flip it and show that like a girl can be strong. So that would be one where like it, just double check that it would be appropriate for your school just because of the brand. The Before Alexa one, that one's meant to be funny. Ellen DeGeneres is in it, but it's kind of like what life was like before Alexa. So that one's got a little bit of humor in it. And then the Sally Seashells Squarespace ad, that one is, I think, kind of interesting as well. Students might not know what Squarespace is, but it's it's like you can make your website or your business website on Squarespace. But if they don't know what Squarespace is, that might actually be a good thing to have them analyze as like, okay, you've never heard of this brand before. What do they do? Because if that's not clear in their messaging, then no one's going to buy their product. So that actually might be a good lead in. And then there was a Disney Plus commercial where it was like playing on the expression GOAT, like greatest of all time, except they have like, so trying to say like Disney Plus is like got all the greatest of all time, but then there are actual goats in the commercial dressed up like Disney characters. So it's kind of meant to be funny. So that would be another one that I think students might enjoy. So anyway, you are welcome to use any of this or none of it. You're welcome to repurpose it if you like this idea. But I think it's an interesting way to introduce the rhetorical situation, but also really start to weave in a little bit of the conversation of rhetorical choice, because I think students are able to understand some of the choices, even if they don't necessarily have the vocabulary for it. Like they might not realize it's a choice, but they'll be able to tell you like, hey, this commercial is funny, or hey, there was a shift in this commercial, or there's contrast in this commercial. But also commercials sometimes have unique rhetorical choices, if we want to call it that. So like voiceover, something called B-roll, where like, you've probably seen it, but it's like you're focusing on the main person, and then there's like another image that kind of comes in that's like not the main person, if you will. Some of your students might know these terms better than I can explain it. But there's different techniques that we use in film to convey the message that students will pick up on that might not totally translate to a speech, but you get the idea. So anyway, let me check the chat. Love the idea for commercial analysis for visuals too. Yeah, because I know some teachers will teach like the visual analysis to help prepare for synthesis as well. And so you could use commercials. You could, in theory, I don't know that I would start with this, but you could, with the visual analysis, there's plenty of like visual rhetoric out there, propaganda, memes, all kinds of stuff. There's some really great posts that people have put in some of the Facebook groups about visual rhetoric. For me personally, some of the images are very thought-provoking, but I personally could not use them in my classroom. That's not to say that they're not good images. It's not to say that other people shouldn't use them. But I have to be very careful where I am. So I try to make sure that the stuff I put out there for other teachers to use is pretty, I don't know, like clean, if you will. So yeah. So anyway, you're welcome to use that as needed, but I wanted to give you all a little thank you for, coming to these lives, whether it was just tonight or all three, because I see a lot of names in the chat that have been here and I just really appreciate your support. So I wanted to give you a little thank you for that as well. Let's see. I like to talk about modes. Yes, I think modes are important. And it definitely covers some of the stuff we were talking about before. So like definition, comparison, exemplification. Yes, modes can be really helpful as well. There aren't a lot of passages that I teach that I can think of that have definition, but there's definitely a few, and students are able to pick up on that well. So and then like comparison and contrast and exemplification. We talked about examples. So yeah, modes are something where I might not always use the term mode with my students, but I definitely do reinforce those skills. So okay, so how are we doing? Any questions in the chat? If not, then I just wanted to kind of give a quick announcement before we close in case the opportunity is of interest to people. I try to make content for teachers, lives like this, and just little things like the commercial analysis to make your life easier. One of the things that I've been working on recently is a 9-week unit for rhetorical analysis. And I intend to post it on TPT like next week because it took forever, but I'm super proud of it. So I hope it proves to be very useful for teachers. But I actually also have a rhetorical analysis course that I do, and I decided to take that 9-week bonus or that 9-week resource and make it a bonus for the course and stuff as well. So if you are interested in that, I won't say too much about it here because I don't want this to be like a sales pitch or anything. But if you are interested in learning more and you're like, hey, I really want to know how you put this all together and I want to learn from you, I do have a course that is opening for the next few days for people to enroll. So if you would like more information about that, you're welcome to reach out to me. But if you're like, nope, not for me, no, thank you, I will not be offended. I just appreciate your presence here tonight. But I did want to let people know that as much as I put out there, I do have other things that I've been working on kind of behind the scenes to help teachers even more. So anyway, that was the big announcement. I guess it was kind of anticlimactic. But anyway, if anyone has any final questions about line of reasoning, let me know. Or if you have any questions, yes, Kate, it's the one that you're already in. Kate was one of my very first founding members in this one. And Kate, because you're already in it, you should have access to the 9-week unit as well. Because I felt like people who are already in should get that bonus too. I didn't want to be stingy. So if you log in, then you should have access to it under your bonus section. I just put it in there today. Melinda, great question. Thank you for asking. Let me put the link in the chat for anyone who's interested. And that way, if there are questions, I'd be happy to answer it. Let's see. But it is self-paced, and it's something you can do on your own. I walk you through the rhetorical situation, rhetorical choices. We talk about how to teach the essay writing process, and there are bonuses in there as well. So you'll get sentence frames for rhetorical analysis. You'll get an ebook that I made about teaching rhetorical analysis, or it's called Mastering Rhetorical Analysis. That one can be given to students too if you find it helpful, but it is pretty comprehensive. But if you're the type who likes to read and not watch videos, that is there. And then I just uploaded that 9-week unit. And if you're like, hey, I really want that 9-week unit, but I'm not interested in the course, that's okay too. I will be putting the 9-week unit on TPT, but basically like it's included in the course as well. And yeah, and if anyone here, let me just put my email in the chat because in case people have like questions that, or if they want to follow up and they're not wanting to talk online, you are more than welcome to contact me. I'm gonna make sure I type my email address right because that'd be embarrassing. Okay. So yeah, if you would like more information or if you have questions about it, I'd be happy to address those. I did decide to offer like a bonus for anyone who signs up before July 10th. I would like to offer people the opportunity for a Zoom call if you sign up like within the next day or so. And I'm happy to do individual calls. So if you want to kind of show me a lesson that you're thinking of, or if you want to talk about a syllabus, or if you just want to ask questions or vent or whatever, I'd be happy to do that as well. So that would be for people who sign up in the next like day or so. But the course will be open for signups through the 13th. And if you're on my email list, I will be sending out some emails about it. I'm going to try not to spam people's inbox, but I do want people to know it exists. So yeah, anyway, that was the big announcement. Can y'all tell I hate talking about this kind of stuff? I put a lot of work into it, but when it comes time to talk about it, I always get a little bit shy. All right. So any other questions? You don't have to ask questions about the course. If you have questions about AP Lang, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you, Melinda. Also, if you guys like these lives, we do a teacher chat once a month, which is kind of like this, but a little bit different. But if you have suggestions for other topics, maybe like later on in the semester, if you guys want to do more of these, I'd be happy to do them. I tried to come up with topics that are like beginning of the year appropriate, but if we get a month or two into the school year and you're like, hey, like, could you do a live about this topic? Or could you incorporate this in a teacher chat? I would love to do that as well. Oh, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Tara and Kathleen. All right, well, awesome. If there are no questions, then I'm going to let you guys go enjoy your Friday night. But thank you so much for spending time with me. I hope the resources have been helpful. And like I said, if you have questions about anything throughout the school year, my inbox is always open. You can also reach out on Instagram or Facebook, and I do my best to respond. But email is definitely a great way to get a hold of me. So yeah, let me know how I can help you. All right. So bye, everyone. Thank you again so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you guys have a very restful weekend.